Hey, I'm Bryson Carter. We're going to be talking about the heart today, action potentials in the heart, the different autorhythmic cells or the cardiac myofibril cells, different volumes, and ECG tracings. We'll just dive into it. All right. So the heart is so cool. Can you see that? Okay, you can kind of see that. So, kind of get a baseline, layout of the heart. Here's our right atria. Here's our right ventricle, left atria. And we've got our SA node right there, our AV node right there, our Bachman's bundle. Okay, then we've got our bundle of His. We've got our left bundle branches, and then our right bundle branches for these things. And then we've got our Purkinje fibers. These are both our Purkinje fibers going up the ventricles. Purkinje fibers. Cool. So Purkinje fibers, all these things that I just listed are more like the autorhythmic cells of the heart, especially with the SA node. And we're going to focus on the SA node. But each of these centers, they don't work to contract the heart. They are the ones, the cells in these areas are responsible for the pace of the heart. And all the other cells in the heart are just the cardiac myofibril cells. All right, let's go over what the action potentials look like. So a quick refresher, we'll get to ECGs later. ECGs only measure the current on the outside of the cells. Action potentials, we're measuring the current, like the electricity, the current differences between the outside and the inside of the cell. Super important to remember that, to kind of not lock that down in your memory, because these graphs are different. All right, so here we've got millivolts on our y-axis and time on our x-axis. Same thing here, time, millivolts. All right, we're going to start with cardiac myofibril cells. So this is cells action potential. Action potentials. This is just the muscle cell of the heart, and we're just going to be focusing on the membrane potential of the myofibrils in this graph. And then right here we're going to be focusing on the autorhythmic. Throw cardiac in there, cardiac cells. Cool. So these, we'll get to those, why they're called auto, because it's the pacemaker of the heart. It's super cool. All right, but first, your good old cardiac myofibril cells. We have resting membrane potential right here at minus 90 millivolts. That's pretty darn close to the Nernst potential of potassium. So if you don't remember that Nernst potential, go back and watch that video. But basically, Nernst potential is like the ideal balance of chemical and electrical gradients for potassium, and the Nernst potential is unique for each ion in each situation. Anyways, so 94 is typically where potassium wants to be, negative 94, between the outside and the inside membrane. Voltage, like how much or pressure or work can be done. That's what voltage is, right? So here we're sitting at minus 90. Okay, let's just put threshold right here. And a graded potential, something from this thing gets sent, and it enters this cell through gap junctions and also just through the membrane potential, so through membrane contact. But gap junctions is a big deal too in the heart. That allows extra connectivity, right? They're like tunnels in between each cell. Okay, so some gradient potential happens, and okay, that causes this to happen. Let me verify that it does that. Yep, okay. So gradient potential makes the rest of the membrane potential more positive, and then bam, just action potential totally happens. This is because of good old voltage gated sodium channels. Okay, but then we see this. This isn't new. Okay, what's happening? Well, sodium's having a heyday. It's like, yes, we're making this place positive, finally. No more Debbie Downers or no more negative Nancys. Okay, but then we have something called ITO channels. This stands for, I don't know what the I is, I think it's like flow or something. But the TO, it's a transient outward channels, ITO channels. So those open up, and that lets potassium out of the cell. And so transient, the word transient means like changing, right? Or it's, fluid. So, but the reason why we use transient in this case is because this channel is like rapid channel, just like opens up so fast, and tons of potassium goes out of the cell. Now, I was also told that chloride goes into the cell as well with the ITO channels being opened up. So that happens, that causes a repolarization, right? So potassium leaving, making it more negative, chloride coming in, making it more negative. And that's why we see this, bam, this quick repolarization. But we've got ourselves L-type and T-type calcium channels that are like, wait a second, we can't let the negative Nancys ruin the day. I probably shouldn't make fun of the name Nancy, but we can't let this become so negative anymore. We can't let this happen. So these pop open, and by the time these are starting to open like right here, but by this time they're like fully open, and now I'm letting tons of calcium into the cell. Calcium's positive, it's going to just keep it more positive, and this is called the plateau phase. Well, potassium's like, I'm not having it. Let's open up, let's bring our backup potassium channels. So we've got our IKUR channels. So I don't know, flow of, whatever. Potassium, K is the potassium. U, ultra. R, rapid. Okay, these are ultra rapid channels. They're like, no, we gotta make this place negative. So these pop open. So then, but then calcium's like, oh, we're still battling this, okay? So it keeps going. What's next? IKR channels. These aren't ultra rapid. These are just rapid potassium channels. And they're like, okay, we're joining the fight. Like we got our battle gear on. We're a little slow to the fight, but we're here. All right, well, it still isn't going down as fast. It's like, oh, we're barely winning this. So who comes to the show? Granddad. All right, Granddad. O. Darn, I forgot this one. Oh, IKS, of course. Psh, that's why it's Granddad, because it's the slowest. Okay, so Granddad, when Granddad shows up, he's like, all right, guys, it's time to end this fight. I'm making this place negative. It's the slowest to open channel, but it's the most, it just adds that much more. Okay, so right here, we see it go bam. And here we've got IK1 channels that are open, and that allows it to, and these are finally open now. So it just goes straight down to negative 90. It doesn't hyperpolarize at all. It just goes down to negative 90, just bam, right there. So that's the cardiac myofibril action potential. Okay, we've got some important things, L type and T type. L, I don't know what L stands for. Let's see. I don't know what L stands for or T, but I'm pretty sure T means transient. So this one is the faster of the two channels. So that one's pops open. L type is open too. Those things are important, keeping that plateau phase. Okay. Some things to think about with this: hyperkalemia. Too much potassium on the outside of the cell. Well, potassium doesn't want to leave so fast. So what's going to end up happening? The calcium's going to be keeping it positive for a lot longer. So this is going to be a lot slower. Okay, so that means more, it's a delayed action potential or like delayed or elongated refractory period, okay? So just some important things to think about there. All right, let's move to autorhythmic cardiac cells. This is so cool, so crazy how the cell can do this. And I'll just explain it, and then I'll go into kind of some details about it. But so we're here, like, I don't know, this is like negative 60. Here's like negative 50 millivolts. That's threshold, okay? Well, we just start off. The second our heart forms in the womb, we just bam. We're just doing this. Bam. Bam. You know what's crazy is that this doesn't change. This, well, unless you're dead or sick, but this has been going on since our heart was formed. That's pretty incredible. Okay, so what's happening? This HCN channel opens up the more negative the inside of the membrane becomes. But what happens when it opens up? It opens up and lets sodium inside the cell. Sodium rushes inside the cell, causing it to become more positive, the membrane potential on the inside. And then, bam, threshold is reached. This pops open, and so I'm going to do that. Sodium right there. Well, right here we've got L-type calcium channels. And L-type calcium channels, they're a little bit slower to open, right? But they're strong. They let calcium in. And that's why we see this rounded, depolarized curve, because calcium's rushing in, and there's a lot of it, okay? So what happens next? Well, I was going to say, I think L-type calcium channels close, but I actually don't know the details about that, so that would be cool to learn one day. But potassium leak channels, they just do their good old duty and open up and let potassium outside the cell like it wants to normally. That causes repolarization. But here's the cool part. Check this out. HCN stands for hyperpolarized cyclic nucleotide. So I'll break this name down. But what HCN channels do, like I said, they become open. So HCN channels are a sodium channel, a voltage-gated sodium channel, but they become open when it becomes more negative inside the cell. So we can imagine, like right here, you know, like as we're going down in charge, right? It's getting a little more negative, a little more negative. Maybe like 1 or 2 on the membrane are opening, 3, whatever. Now we're at 100. Okay, now we're at 2,000. All right, and then finally, once we get negative enough, this battle between potassium trying to make it more negative and HCN being like, now is my time to shine, it overcomes it, and there are now like maybe 5,000 HCN channels on the membrane that are open at this point, right around negative 60 millivolts. And that's causing sodium to rush into the cell. And so sodium then obviously causes this greater potential that reaches threshold. And that threshold allows L-type calcium channels to open up, causing this whole action potential again. So the cool part is this. We'll do it right here. Okay. So I asked my professor about this and like how HCN opens up when it gets more negative, and he just said, well, think about a voltage-gated sodium channel. Now just pick that up, turn it like upside down, put it back in the membrane, and that's how it happens. So I'm going to like review some things and walk through this idea. I say that, preface that, because I actually haven't done research on this. I just kind of took his word for it, so I'm just going to throw out the idea. I might be wrong, but it's going to emphasize or teach or elaborate how HCN channels open up when it gets more negative inside the cell. Okay, so normally we've got ourselves this happy voltage-gated sodium channel. Okay, so we've got this springy thingy, this alpha helix of a protein complex, and calcium is bound inside, okay? So we've got these positive charges. Normally, here we've got out and in. When a cell, no action potential is happening, normally there are negative charges on the inside and there are positive charges on the outside, created by the sodium-potassium pump, one of the most important pumps in the body. In fact, probably the most important pump. Okay? These positive charges on the outside of the cell are repelling. They're like two magnets that you match up the ends that don't go together. They are repelling. So there's a downward force. It's repelling the calcium, the positive calcium inside this springy thing, the alpha helix. Okay, there's also these negative charges on the inside of the cell, and they're pulling on the calcium. So what we have is this net force that's pushing on this end of this like protein gate, pretty much. Well, I hope you remember this, but if I push down on this end of the marker, this end of the marker went up, right? So same thing here. If I'm pushing down, that other end of the marker is going up. That's closing this sodium channel. Right, quick review of that. Obviously, when a greater potential happens and these insides become more positive and these outsides become more negative, then this arrow changes, and now it's going up like that. Well, if it's going up, it's going to pop open. Once it pops open, sodium rushes in, causing more of these channels to do just what it just did, and then this whole little thingy mabobber just mechanically snaps shut. But there's a moment of delay before it just snaps shut that sodium has enough time to get in. Okay, so now, yeah, you can still see this. Check this out. Imagine with me that this channel is upside down. The sodium channel. Okay? You got your membrane, okay, and you got your calcium in this alpha helix, the springy thingy. Well, if the inside, and so normally, let's remember our normal charges are negatives on the inside, so negatives on the inside, and positives on the outside, right? Well, check it out. If that's the case, then the more negative the inside of the cell becomes, so the more hyperpolarized it is going down, the more negative charges there are down here, the more this calcium is attracted to this, which also means that the more positive charges that accumulate on the outside repel this. So in all, you get a downward force on the springy thingy that's attached to this side of this gate. And if we do this, downward force there, what do we see? Is that this is opening up. So that's why, and then if this is opening up, then sodium's rushing into the cell. So this is why the more negative charge there is on the inside of the cell, the more of these HCN channels are going to be open, letting sodium rush into the cell. And then there's a moment where that negativeness, or the negativity of the inside of the cell, gets overcome by the positivity of the incoming sodium. And that's what we see here. Well, incoming sodium enough to change the inside enough to cause the L-type calcium channels to pop open. And that causes the whole action potential. Really cool. All right, so hyperpolarized, that's what I just explained. But cyclic nucleotide, what the heck is that? Cyclic nucleotides are like this, cyclic AMP. So, beta 1, we memorized this earlier. Beta 1 causes an increase in cyclic AMP. Now, beta 1, you'll remember, that's an adrenergic receptor. So that is stimulated by norepinephrine and epinephrine. It prefers epinephrine, beta 1, has a higher affinity for epinephrine. And dopamine's in there with the adrenergic, but basically norepi and epi are what will trigger this, and that causes cyclic AMP through a whole cascade of things, which I'll go over later. That to increase cyclic AMP goes and binds to these HCN channels and causes them to be open. So if you're opening these more easily, they're not so dependent on the hyperpolarization of the cell. So that means that these are opening, like more of them, faster and sooner if you just go stick a key on it, like cyclic AMP is, and that would release lead to a steeper slope. Well, if it's a steeper slope, remember this is time, that means that there's a shorter amount of time than there would be otherwise. This is how you increase heart rate. That's why when you are driving down the road and somebody cuts you off, you almost slam into them. Well, your adrenal medulla gets innervated by your sympathetic nervous system that releases epinephrine. Soon that epinephrine hits your heart and bam, it just, you can hear your heartbeat in your ears. It's crazy. Okay, so now let's go on to EKG or ECG. Somebody told me that the difference between EKG and ECG is nothing, that EKG is like a German version of the ECG. I don't know, whatever. But okay, so ECG, I'm going to erase this. I'm going to leave this heart, and we'll do that. Okay. So here we've got our tricuspid valve and our bicuspid valve. Just to orient you. So to the atria, because now we're going to go and talk about what we see. Some standardizations of ECGs. Somebody said that we're going to put a negative electrode up on top and a positive electrode on the bottom, or inferior part of the heart, and we're going to measure electric fields between these two electrodes and then record the results on paper. So on your ECG, you have millivolts as your y-axis, and then you have time as your x-axis. But check it out, we're not measuring action potentials in the same sense as we did here. Okay, these action potentials were the inside and outside of the cell. With ECGs, we're only measuring the outside of the cell. Okay, so the SA node, it's going to cause an action potential like we reviewed over here. Okay, and what happens is normally I'm just going to draw a bunch of plus signs. Normally, this is what we're at. The cells of heart, every cell actually resting has a positive outside, negative inside because of the sodium potassium pump. But when an action potential occurs, these change to be negative. The outside of the cell. Well, as soon as, and imagine with me that the whole heart is covered in plus signs, okay? As soon as the action potential happens and there's like a negative, then there's a difference, there's an electric field, and we can measure that now. And how we measure that is through these electrodes. And there's some wizardry and some fancy cool physics stuff that there's a lot more to it, but I'm not going to go into that detail because I don't know it very well. But what we're going to do is conventionally we're going to say that there is a charge vector traveling like this. And because why it's traveling like this is because these cells had an action potential occur in them, and so now they're all negative. Well, and we know how action potentials propagate down, so they're going to change the cells that are connected to them to be negative. They're going to change the next cells, right? And it's like a domino effect. So we've got this negative wave. Imagine like you're at a football game, and you're looking at the stadium. You're a player. You see people start the wave. Well, in this case, pretend like all the people are keeping their hands up in the air. That's what we see with the negative symbol. So this wave is going to travel down the heart. I left Bachmann's bundle up here because Bachmann's bundle is composed of these massive cells that are very thick, which leads to a RI being super low, and which ultimately leads to the length constant. So the resistance of the inside of the cell is really low because they're so thick comparatively, and that leads rapid propagation of the action potential. So even though it starts here in the SA node, it basically starts the whole way across, because Bachmann's bundle allows that action potential to travel so fast through it that it's almost like it's just starting evenly at the top of these atria. Okay, so that's Bachmann's bundle. We have a negative vector traveling from a negative electrode down to a positive electrode. And by convention, if we have a negative vector traveling towards a positive electrode, we are going to say that this line on the ECG goes up. So anytime, even if it's a positive going towards a negative, right? A positive influence or electric field traveling towards a negative electrode, we're going to call it's going up. We're going to show that it's going up on the ECG. So that's just standardized. Well, what if it's going a negative to a negative? We're going to show that as going down on the ECG. So now that we've got those rules, I'm actually going to leave the rules up here in the corner. So if we've got a positive charge traveling to a negative electrode, or a negative traveling towards a positive electrode, then we see up on our graph, ECG. Okay, so we have all of these collective vectors traveling like that. And they're all traveling down until they get to the end of the atria. And so we're just going to split this into two groups, the top, the atria, and the ventricles. And these vectors eventually are going to change everything to be negative. Okay, so everything is now negative in both of the atria. And so, but before we finish let's say that before we get there, let's say we're at this point where there's just a few little positives left. Well, the ECG is like, most of it's negative, but we're still having a negative charge vector traveling towards a positive electrode. So it's like, okay, and this is in time. So it says, okay, I'm just going to put a dot right here. Because here's baseline, right here. Let's call that 0. There's baseline. And so it's like, well, we're almost all the way negative, or one charge, unicharged, but we're not there, so it still is above. And then let's say, working kind of a little backwards, let's say there's just a few more positives. It's like, well, we're right there. Okay, when we were 50-50, there was 50% negative charges and 50% positive charges, we're at the top, as high as this little peak can go. And so, but then fast forward, once we get all the way to one charge and everything is negative, then there's no difference, there's no charge vector traveling anymore. And I forgot to say this at the very beginning, but this would probably be better. When we have a entire electric field that's just one charge, it doesn't measure anything. there's no difference that it can pick up on. So we're at 0 baseline. And so once we get to this point, all the atria are at 0, so we come back to baseline. Now, this is the part that really was confusing for a second for me. The ECG just connects these data points, these dots. Even though this one was up high, like this one is still considered up according to these rules. Okay, and you'll see. So it connects all the dots. Because I was like, well, wait a second. Why is it traveling down if we're still following this rule of, opposite charge vector traveling towards the opposite electrode? Well, no, it's just because the ECG connects the dots, and each of these dots were above the baseline. Okay, so now that we've covered that, we're going to call this the P wave. Now we have a moment of time where it's just still chill. Then the bundle of His, AV node, the bundle of His, these bundle branches are going to send this action potential that just occurred down to the rest of the heart. Well, it sends it, but since the heart is kind of like this, it's more tilted. I should have drawn it more tilted. We're going to have so normally we have positives, right? And positives here. Now we're going to have the left side depolarize first before the right side. So what that looks like is we have these negatives, and then right off the bat, we have a charge vector with a negative tail, but where is it going traveling towards? We can draw multiple of these. If you add up these vectors and find out the average vector of charge, it's traveling like this with a negative tail. And where is it pointing more towards? It's pointing more towards the negative electrode. Well, what's our rule? If they're opposites, if the charge is traveling towards the opposite electrode, then it's going up on the ECG. But then if it's traveling towards the same charge electrode as its charge, then we're going to go down on the ECG, and that's what we see here. Boom. Okay, that just happens for a split second though. And once this whole thing becomes equally negatively charged, then we're going to resume our normal travel of charge. Going to go affect these cells down here that are still positive. And here we get an average vector with a negative tail going towards a positive electrode. And since they're opposites, we're going to go up. Well, this is represented by this line right here. But then at this point, this is what we see. With all of these being negative, because these eventually will get there, as the action potential propagates down, it propagates kind of like this, like, right? And so what we see is a net, an average net vector, charge vector, with a negative tail still traveling towards a positive. But since we're in the ventricles and this is happening all at once and it's massive, then we see a massive upward peak. And that, okay, so right here, this was called the Q wave. That little depolarization of the left ventricular septum represents the Q wave. Then this depolarization of the ventricles represents what we call the R wave. The R wave is the most noticeable wave of all of the ECG waves. Okay, we're at this point, and we have all of the ventricles are depolarized, and meaning that the outside is negative and the inside of the cell is positive. So opposite of what's normally to be. But check it out. This part right here of the heart, the left superior ventricle is a lot bigger comparatively than the right side. So while everything else has just depolarized and we had this big R wave, we start, just like normal, these negative vectors are starting to go like this. Well, what do you think is the net or the average charge vector? It's got to be something like this. And we know that it's got a negative tail because we're depolarizing things from our initial action potential. Well, is this pointing more towards this positive electrode or more towards this negative electrode? It's definitely pointing more towards this negative electrode. And so because it's a negative end tail going towards a negatively charged, a negative electrode, and that's the same, it's not opposite, we're not going to go up anymore, we're going to go down. And so then the ECG is like, oh, this value is actually a down value below the baseline. So it like the data point where it should go on it in the mind is like right there. It's like, oh, it needs to go down. And then, but the ECG doesn't like just pick up its recording thing and drop down there and start from here. No, it traces it. So that's why we see that downward portion of the R wave. Because remember, here was baseline. And it's like, oh, this value is just a little bit of a downward reading, negative to negative reading. Okay, so that is going to almost complete our QR, you guessed it, this is going to be the S wave right there. So that's the bottom of the S wave, which is, so S wave represents the depolarization of the left superior ventricle. Okay, what's next? Oh yeah, so check it out. These are negative, and then everything else is negative. These are still negative, so the entire heart is negative, negatively charged on the outside. It's all been depolarized. So this ECG is like, well, there's no charge for me to measure today at this point. So I'm just going to come back to baseline. So now we're just starting here. But then, right, it doesn't, it just draws up to that point. It's lazy, whatever. So that's the completion of the S wave. So now we're back to baseline. We're chilling, okay? But we're chilling for a split second because of this plateau phase. So this little split second of time is existing because of the plateau phase, because of those L and T type calcium channels that are trying to prevent everybody from being negative. all those different potassium channels from opening up. But eventually, potassium overcomes and everybody becomes more negative on the inside. So the positivity goes to the outside. And so what do we get? And that comes from down here. We get, actually let me do this. We get a repolarization of this is measuring the outside of the cell. So these cells down here starts to repolarize, sending the repolarization vectors. Okay, and these now send, and these are all negatives. The whole heart was negative, right? Sends this wave. It's like the wave at the football game. Everybody went like this, and everybody kept their hands up the entire time. And so, in the entire time, the wave reached the whole stadium. And then once the waves at the end of the stadium did this, then they let them back down and send the wave back all the way to the other side, to where it started. And so now we've got a positive tailed charge vector, traveling to a negative electrode, and that follows our rule that if it's an oppositely charged charge vector traveling towards the electrode, then we go up in our ECG. So it's like, okay, so we're here, because that's like the distance above the distance, your Y value or whatever, is like this many cells out of the whole heart. And then we get further, and so it's like, okay, put another data point, we're up here. Okay, so eventually we're going to have more positives than there are negatives, and there's just a few little negatives. So once we're at 50-50, we're at the peak of our wave right there with that data point. And then since there's just a few negatives left, it's like, well, we're just barely above baseline. And then, and baseline's like right here. But finally, all repolarization happens. All the outside of the cells are positive, and it returns to baseline. Then the ECG just traces out those data points. Now we're all one charge. That is the T wave. The T wave represents the repolarization of the heart. So some things that I want to learn more about, just brush up on, is I want to remind myself why these initiate repolarization before these do. Because wouldn't it make sense that since these depolarized first, they would repolarize first? But no, we see that repolarization initiates from the apex of the heart, which is down here, inferior, and it just goes like that. Okay, so that's what I want to learn more about. But let's move on. Okay, so we're going to discuss a very dense list of discuss a very dense list of pathways that cause inotropic, lusitropic, and chronotropic effects on the heart. So a lot of words there, big words. What we're going to do though is break it down. We got our nifty notes here. Okay, quick review. Remember how we had HCN right here? HCN was a hyperpolarized cyclic nucleotide channel that has beta 1 influencing it, and which beta 1 causes an increase in CAMP, or activation of the beta 1 causes an increase in CAMP, which causes HCN channels to be opened more, which causes a steeper, that increases its speed. Okay, so kind of throwing this out there, beta blockers, pretty sure that's why they work to slow the heart rate down. If you got a really fast heart rate, you need some beta blockers. Then we're going to go into why beta is the magic in the heart. So we've got beta 1 and these are adrenergic receptors, which means they're stimulated by epi and norepi, but mainly remember epinephrine has a higher affinity for beta 1 than norepi. But okay, so that's going to cause beta 1 is a G protein. So there's alpha, beta, gamma subunits on the G protein. That's going to cause this alpha subunit to come over here and do some magic. Okay, so what is this alpha subunit going to do? It is going to influence an L-type, alpha sub plus L-type calcium channel, and that's going to open up, or sorry, it's going to increase the open probability, I don't know why that's a hard word to spell right now for some reason, of calcium channels. So what does that mean? So it's going to cause the probability to be higher that they're going to be open. What's that going to lead to? It's going to lead to more calcium influx. That is going to lead to more concentration of calcium inside the cell, and that's going to lead to more calcium induced ryanodine, ryanodine receptor channel from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Pretty cool right here, because that, if you have more calcium, you're going to have more contractility of the heart, and we call that inotropic effect. So that's going to increase the contractility, and we're going to call that inotropic. Effect. Really cool. So when you hear inotropic, don't think of ionotropic versus metabotropic channels. Nope, don't think about that. It's kind of related though, if you think about it, but think of inotropic. Inotropic. Okay. The next thing that the alpha subunit is going to do is going to cause an increase in cyclic AMP. Remember how beta 1 just causes cyclic AMP? This is how. So that alpha subunit goes, and it really goes to adenylyl cyclase, and that causes cyclic AMP to be synthesized from ATP. So this is cyclic AMP is going to go meet up with its home slice pKa. Protein, sounds like a Smash Bros, you know, pKa something, I don't know, whatever. But protein kinase A. Okay, so this protein kinase A, it's a homie. It does a ton of things in the cell. Talking about like a workhorse of the cell, kind of like ATP, but no, it's pKa. Protein kinase A, when you see kinase, think it's going to be kind and give phosphates to things. So it's going to do a ton of phosphorylation. And to write phosphorylation, I'm just going to write pH for now. Maybe actually PHO, pho, okay? It's going to phosphorylate troponin I. Now, quick review. Mickey Mouse, troponin, we have an I subunit, a C subunit, and a T subunit. Troponin, the I subunit binds to actin, which it also binds to tropomyosin, and this C subunit is exposed to calcium. It has 4 binding sites. 2 of them are low affinity, 2 of them are high affinity. So when there's low calcium concentrations, then calcium is just bound to it, allowing this troponin to be bound to tropomyosin and actin, covering the action or covering the ATP binding sites, preventing myosin motorheads from binding to actin and doing its contraction deal. But with phosphorylation of troponin I, this subunit, that is going to increase the rate, we're going to call it increase the off rate of calcium off of troponin, I'm just going to abbreviate trop C. So what? Phosphorylation causes calcium to get off of this faster. Well, remember there's 4 binding sites for calcium, and when 2 of them are only occupied, then this goes back to occupying actin, preventing contraction. Well, with off rate faster, that's going to make these calcium get off of this faster, which means that it's going to bind to actin faster and tropomyosin faster. So what is that going to lead to? That's going to lead to an increase of the speed of relaxation. So the muscles, if there's less myosin heads bound to actin, that means it's going to relax. So this increases phosphorylation of troponin I, leads to the off rate, leads to the faster speed of relaxing. So we're calling this the lusitropic effect. This whole speed of relaxation. A lusitropic effect means it's able to relax faster. What does that do to the duration of contraction? I hope you said that it decreases, because it does. It decreases the duration of contraction because if something contracts and then slowly relaxes, that's a longer contraction, whereas it just contracts and it contracts and let goes, and that's a faster relaxing. Okay, so lusitropic effect. Oops, wrong thing to. Then we're we're gonna go right on to the next thing that pKa phosphorylates. Man, pKa is the homie of this system. So pKa phosphorylates this cool thing called phospholambin. I don't know what that is, but phospholambin, once it's phosphorylated, it's got an extra phosphate, then it goes and increases the activity of our circa 2A pumps. Not really sure what this 2A means, but just we know what circa pumps do. And that causes an increase in calcium reuptake. And that causes a increase in the speed of relaxation. Well, what did we call that here? Lusitropic effect. You can think of it like if it's relaxing faster, it's getting loose faster. So lusitropic effect. That's what's going to happen here. Lusitropic effect. Okay. Like I said, this is a pretty dense full system, but as you can see, beta 1 so far has a lot of pathways that it can cause the heart to be faster, basically, and to crunch stronger. This causes more calcium inside the cell, which causes it to contract harder because more calcium, able to bind a troponin I. But then this causes troponin I to get cleared of calcium faster. And then this phospholambin causes calcium to be taken up into the cell faster. So it's just speeding up the whole process. Well, it continues. pKa is tirelessly continuing, and it's going to do some more phosphorylation of ryanodine receptor channels. Okay, so ryanodine receptor channels, you're going to get phosphorylated. That is going to lead to dissociation of calstabin. Now, I want you to literally think of how this word sounds. Calstabin. And think of some Western person saying, calcium's got to stay in. Well, it's abbreviated. So, calstabin, calcium stays in. If calstabin is bound to ryanodine receptors, then it keeps calcium inside that sarcoplasmic reticulum, the SR. So if it causes a dissociation of that, no more calstabin, then calcium is going to get out because it's no longer staying in by calstabin. Okay, so this leads to open probability of ryanodine channels. So kind of like what we had here, it increases the probability that ryanodine channels will open up, allowing calcium to get out. Okay, I am going to just abbreviate the rest of this. We know what happens when we have more calcium inside the cell. Oh, my lights. We have contractility, the inotropic effect. So this is the inotropic effect. Okay, inotropic effect. There's one last thing that phosphorylation does, or that pKa does. That's going to come and phosphorylate L-type calcium channels. That's right, you guessed it. You probably didn't. It then causes the same thing, increased probability. And then basically, it's the same thing right here. So these L-type calcium channels, not only does the alpha subunit go help them be more open, but so does PKA, protein kinase A, go and help those calcium channels be open, which causes more calcium to rush into the cell and everything to work faster. Really cool. So, okay, now we're gonna continue talking about beta 1 because we're not done. We just had a lot of stuff to write out for this. Okay. We've got beta 1. I hope you can see that. Yeah, you can. So beta 1 alpha subunit goes to adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase. That goes, creates cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP goes, finds its way to HCN channels on those autorhythmic cardiac cells, which open up the more hyperpolarized the cell gets, the more negative it gets. Well, that is going to lead to more sodium coming inside the cell. Okay, well, if that happens, I already spoke about this, the steepness of the curve increases. Check it out. This is what we're talking about. Bam. That steepness increases the more HCN has cyclic AMP bound to it. So steepness of the curve, of the slope, increases that, and that is going to lead to faster heart rate, HR, heart rate. Okay? Let's continue with this idea. Cyclic AMP causes more PKA, protein kinase A. And in short, we can say that PKA causes more calcium influx. That causes steepness, increase of steepness of the slope, which we already know that causes increase in heart rate. But it also causes the threshold to be more negative, which causes an increase in heart rate. Honestly, I think that I don't understand this part, and I kind of think it's a typo. I think it's wrong, but that's what I learned in my textbook. But I just kind of going through it, couldn't really break down why it makes it the threshold. Here's RMP, right? It makes the threshold more negative. Never mind. I don't know why I misunderstood that. That makes sense. Oh, no, it doesn't. Here's why. If more calcium inside the cell, wouldn't that threshold isn't going to change? The resting membrane potential should come closer to threshold. And so that's why I think, I don't know if that's really accurate, if the threshold becomes more negative, or if they really just mean to say that the resting membrane potential becomes more positive, closer to the threshold. I don't know. I need to understand that better, but this is really good to understand what a cyclic AMP from adenyl cyclase causes. I am going to summarize and try to work faster through this because we're already at an hour. Jeez. Okay. Negative chronotropic. Oh, okay. So I've introduced you to inotropic, lusitropic. Now we got to talk about chronotropic. Chronotropic has to do with time. This is the speed of the heart, and the thing that I just drew out that was the positive chronotropic effect with cyclic AMP going to HCN that increases this chronotropic effect or causes it to go faster. But this negative chronotropic effect is regulated by muscarinic type 2 receptors on the SA node cells. This is going to cause this beta gamma dimer or heterodimer to go and increase the opening of GERK. So GERK stands for G protein activated inward rectifying potassium channels. Potassium channels. Okay, GERK. So what that means is this is going to these are like special potassium channels that when they're activated they open up, allowing extra potassium to leave the cell. That allows it to become more negative faster. And so that's going to lead to more negative RMP. Well, if it's more negative, it's not as easily excitable, the cells of the heart. So if they're not easily excitable, then it's going to decrease the heart rate. Okay, the other thing that muscarinic type 2 receptors do on the heart is they cause the alpha subunit from this G protein to go and decrease cyclic AMP. And alpha subunits, traders over there, they can cause increase in it, but in this case, in muscarinic type 2, they cause a decrease in cyclic AMP that decreases IF. In other words, it flattens the slope. And that causes a decrease in heart rate. All right, last column. Bear with me, we're doing okay. Alpha subunit, we know that it decreases cyclic AMP. This causes threshold to be, this causes a decrease in the flow of calcium. That causes the threshold to be more positive. Which decreases the heart rate. A lot there. Negative chronotropic effects. Parasympathetic nervous system sends acetylcholine through the vagus nerve to muscarinic type 2 receptors, which are on the sinoatrial node and other places of the heart. That causes these opening of GERK, hyperpolarization, causes decrease in cyclic AMP. That leads to a flattened slope, causes a decrease in the calcium influx, and that causes a more positive threshold. See, once again, a little thrown off by this more positive threshold, where the list before we had more calcium inside, making it more negative. Really thrown off about that. I don't know why. I need to get better at that, though. So we're going to continue to our next topic. Oh boy. We're going to talk about N-STEMI and STEMI, what those two mean. And okay, I do want to briefly touch on how calcium gets into the cell. So here's our cardiac myocyte. Well, we've got our L-type channels, L-type calcium channels. That lets calcium into the cell when a action potential comes. So it's represented that by some waves right there. Causes calcium to come into the cell. Calcium is going to come down to this RYR channel. Calcium is going to bind to it. That lets RYR release more calcium. More calcium gets out into the sarcoplasm, and that does its thing with with the myosin, the actin. It binds to the troponin, which removes the tropomyosin, causing the myosin to bind to the actin, etc. Contraction of the muscle, bam. Well, this SR definitely still has circa pumps, and that pumps circa back into the cell. But check it out, since we had some influx of calcium, in fact we used 10% of extracellular calcium levels comparatively to do this. So we still have some calcium inside the cell that's not being pumped into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's getting kind of crowded. So we're going to have a secondary active transport occur where it lets one calcium out for every 3 sodium ions that are coming in. And then check it out. This sodium-potassium pump sends those 3 sodiums right out again with the ATP. Okay, so that is how calcium gets out of the cell. It also gets reuptaken by circa into the SR. Okay, I'm glad I covered that because it's really important to know it, apparently, according to this. But that's there's going to be a lot of other things that it plays into. It's neat because if our blood calcium levels are off, we can have arrhythmias or improper heartbeats. Okay, STEMI and NSTEMI. We got our heart. Imagine with me that these are farmers' fields down here, actually all over. And here's the pipe of water. These are little irrigation pipes coming off the main pipe. Well, the person at the end of the water trough or the end of the waterway normally gets not dealt with very nicely kind of often because it's the farthest away from the water supply, or in this case blood supply, and that means that this is most likely to get problems down the road. And that's what we see, is that down here on the apex of the heart, blood has a hard time getting all the way to there sometimes. So when that happens, hypoxia becomes a thing. Hypoxia is low hypoxia oxygen, and hypoxia occurs, and then that leads to ischemia, and that is kind of like, that's death of tissue cells, or it's just damage. Ischemia is just damage, and then infarction, I think, is death of cells. Okay, so we're going to zoom in on this, and then we're going to zoom in on an ECG, how we can detect that. Let's do this. Let's say we don't have oxygen or enough blood to this area of the heart. So with not enough blood, that means we have low oxygen. And with low oxygen, our mitochondria, our mitos, don't have a molecule to accept electrons at the end of its electron transport chain. So it can't do its electron transport chain thingy. It can't produce ATP. Well, less ATP, that means the sodium-potassium pump is also not happy. Big frowny face. No sodium-potassium pump, no potassium gradients. In other words, or I guess I should just say less. So when we have hyperkalemia, that means that there's a lot of potassium on the outside of the cell, or in the blood, than on the inside of the cell. And that means that potassium doesn't want to leave the cell as bad. And so that means what we would see here is potassium, yeah, these are open, but potassium's like, I'm chilling because we're all equal now. So we start seeing this plateau phase elongate a lot because potassium isn't rushing out of the cell, making it back to negative. And so what we see is an action potential happens in the heart, boom, everything becomes negative on the outside. Easy peasy, no problem. Sodium loves to rush in, so sodium will come in, rush in, and makes everything negative. I'm going to erase this artery. That's the coronary artery, by the way. Some branches coming off of it. And so the whole heart is negative. Okay? And so I'm going to draw this normal action potential. And then remember we have this got to think about this really quick. STEM. ST, elevation. Ah, okay, that's why. Okay. Okay, so we've got so that's now our electrode, and here's our other electrode. We have our left superior ventricle experiencing a depolarization event, and so that's going to cause, but remember this negatively tailed vector traveling more towards the negative vector or negative electrode, negative to negative. We're going to have a down arrow, so it's going to come down. So far, we're like normal. Okay, but when it comes to the repolarization, this right here, this area of the heart is going to stay negative. Okay, sorry, I should have. Okay, so we start off with a positive going towards a negative. And these are all negatives. Positive tail going towards, so that's normal so far. So we come back to baseline. But then we reach this part of the cell, which is the inner, I should draw some, that's the ventricles, right, in here. Here's the septum. So this inner side, this inner part of the muscle, that's negative. For a second, it stays negative. And so then what you have here is a negative tailed vector pointing towards a negative electrode. Well, it's going to cause it to, here's baseline. It's going to cause it to be down low. And then eventually it gets back oh man, this is a lot harder for a second. So now it's still negative, and it comes back, and since we have a negative vector pointing towards a negative electrode, then we get something like that. And I'm so tired. Okay. We gotta do this. We gotta wrap this up. Okay, picking up. We're gonna be talking about N-STEMI. So you've got your heart. Okay, right here, you've got your coronary artery coming down, supplying your heart. Well, since this is at the end of the artery, it's more likely to have problems with that because it's the farthest away from the source, I guess you could say, of the pump, of the fluid, of the blood. And so this area down here is the problem site, most likely to have a problem. So let's zoom in on these cells and what's happening on these cells right here. So no lower oxygen. Hello? We're back. Lower oxygen leads to less, or lets the mitochondria be sad, which leads to less ATP, and that leads to sad sodium-potassium pumps. That leads to potassium, roughly equaling the concentration on the inside and outside. So because of that, because potassium on the inside and outside they're roughly equal to each other, or there's less of a gradient, potassium doesn't want to leave, so this is having a harder time repolarizing, just like I had a harder time saying that. Wow. And so this means that this plateau phase is going to be a lot longer, slower to contract, or slower to have it repolarize. And so because of that, hypoxia leads to these cells staying negative. So these cells right here stay negative. And what we see is a normal ECG tracing. There's our P wave, Q wave, R, S, T repolarization. But then what we see is a new baseline because so we see a new baseline, and what happens is our S wave comes back down to our used to be baseline, because remember, S wave is when this left superior ventricle depolarizes. At the end of the S wave, the whole thing is one charge. It's all negative. So we're back to our baseline. But then when we repolarize, we see this big T wave. So let's just think through why this is happening. Well, it must be because as we start, if we start up here where these are negatives and these cells are positive down here, what we have is we already have this negative going towards a positive electrode. This is existing already, but then we have this as well, a negative charge vector going towards this positive electrode. So because we have kind of twice as many charge vectors going on, our baseline says, oh, we need to be up higher. And that's why our ECG tracings start occurring at this higher baseline, because it's got two of these vectors going on, and that's why it's like if you have double the effort, remember our rule: if something is oppositely charged headed towards its opposite partner, it's going to be going an up, or the ECG will trace an upward tracing. Well, it's got double that right now happening, so that's why it comes all the way up here, and it's like really high. And but when it comes to repolarization, just before repolarization, the entire heart is negative. So the heart is like, oh, we're back to this baseline. We're back to this normal. So it comes all the way back down. And this is our kind of S wave. And then when we go from negative to positive, when we go from positive to repolarize it, when we go from positive to negative, then we have a higher T wave. This is called ST depression. Or we also say that it is a non-ST elevation. Then we're going to stick MI onto it because it's myocardial infarction. So these two are the same thing. We can recognize it because there's a really big dip in the S wave with a higher T wave, and this absence of the normal dip in the S wave. All right, so there's a lot of problems with that, and I'm getting super tired, but this is due tonight, so I just gotta do it. And that's what happens with NSTEMI. So I need to review that more. But let's review what STEMI is. So ST, elevation, myocardial infarction. Now why would our ST be elevated? Well, it all has to do with our transmural infarct. Okay, that's what happens when this goes really bad and the whole thing gets killed. Just so that all these cells down here just get wiped out, or they're starting to get wiped out because they're all negative because it's not repolarizing. It stays negative on the outside because it's staying positive on the inside because potassium's not leaving the cell. And since it's this glob of negativeness in the bottom or in the apex of the heart, then our normal ECG, we're going to see this. So here's our normal one. Okay, and then we're going to so that was our normal one. But then once we get these negative vectors going towards this positive electrode, but we still have this massive glob of negativeness, then we see a really big negative going towards a negative that's hampering everything, and so it's like, oh, I better be lower. So the baseline decreases, and then P wave happens like quote unquote normal, happens like normal. Q wave happens, R wave happens, and then, but check this out. R wave happens, and then with S, at the end of the S wave, that's, remember, when the whole heart is all at one charge. That's everything is negative. It's all depolarized. So the ECG is like, oh, we're okay. Like we're back to normal. So I better trace this all the way back down to this baseline. So then it's like just chilling there. So then comes the repolarization. Then these cells can't repolarize because they're getting chopped by lack of oxygen and lack of potassium gradients doing what they should. So what we're going to do is then we're going to have this wave of positively end to the tails going toward this negative. So we should see an increase, but then we have this glob of negativeness pointing towards negative electrode. So that's going to reduce the height because it's going to be contributing downwards. So it adds up these averages, and that leads to this T wave kind of going something like this. Not as high as this normal healthy T wave. It still looks really high, so maybe I'll just do this to exaggerate it. Okay, so what do we see here? We see a baseline for us, but we see this S wave. We see this S wave is elevated above. In fact, we see this S and this T wave elevated above where our previous baseline was. So that's our ST elevation myocardial infarction. Man, I need to work on those for sure. Okay. We are now going to move towards yes. That's good. Millimeters of mercury is our y-axis, pressure. X-axis is our time. Okay, so we're going to have this tracing. Okay. Red is our right ventricle. Left is our black is our left ventricle. The aorta is represented by this. This is about 120 millimeters of mercury right there. And this left atrium, or sorry, this is this pressure occurs in this right ventricle. The right ventricle, left atrium. Wow. Okay. Whoa. I've got some things wrong. My bad. It's late. Ventricle, left atrium. Left atria, sorry, left atria. Okay, so red is our left ventricle. Oh my goodness. Ventricle. And that's black. And red is our left atria. Okay, so left atrium right there. The left atria contracts, pushing blood into the left ventricle. We see this beat of pressure. We see this beat of pressure right there. Okay? And this, naturally, the ventricle just got pressed blood into it. So the ventricle is going to be showing some pressure. So the pressure will go up. Okay? But then contraction of the ventricles occurs. Bam. This blood pressure goes, or the ventricle pushes the blood up through the aortic valve, through the semilunar valve leaflets, and through the aorta into the rest of the body. Well, this represents the aorta. Check this out. We see that this aorta gets pressured, or we see the pressure increase in the aorta because of this ventricular contraction. But then we see this little bump right here, this increase of pressure in the aorta. Well, what's that from? Well, the velocity of the blood being pushed through the ventricle, through the semilunar valve, through the aorta, is so much that it has inertia. And the semilunar valves open up from that pressure, but then they close when blood starts coming back down. But when blood comes back down into the ventricle, or to push against the semilunar valves, it causes some pressure to be sensed because of the closing of those semilunar valves, the aortic valve, and that causes our dicrotic notch, which is this pressure. Okay, the younger the person, the less that dicrotic notch will be there, because the arteries are looser, whereas an older person probably has more atherosclerosis, leads to a harder harder pressing of that. Okay, so right here, closing of aortic valve. We're going to call that dub, or sound number 2. Well, what's sound number 1? It's the closing of the bicuspid valve, which is lub. That's sound 1. Now, is there a sound 3? There is. Only if the ventricle walls are more stiff than normal. And in that case, we hear a heart gallop. And that's because when blood is being rushed into the left ventricle from the left atria, or the left atrium, then it causes the sound to be heard if it's stiff, if the walls are stiff. Okay, so what if you hear lub, whoosh, dub? Or lub, whoosh, dub. This is because we have some problems. If it's lub, whoosh, dub, then we probably have a hole in our bicuspid valve, or a problem with it. It's not closing all the way, because lub should be the sound of that bicuspid valve closing right up. And it closes because the ventricle contracts, which causes this blood to be pushed against everything in the left ventricle, and the only thing that can open up is the aortic valve. Well, after the blood goes flying through the aorta, then it starts to come back down, and then it gets some velocity going to that inertia, because it got some far, and then it's coming back down, and then it slams against this, the aortic valve, the semilunar valves. That's why we get this dicrotic notch. But then the closing of those valves is our dub too. So if we hear a lub, whoosh, dub, then that means we have a problem with our semilunar valves. Boy, I'm getting really tired, but we're going to continue with, so that's what the pressure changes, opening, closing of the heart valves. Last graph, we're going to talk about our volume. Okay, so we're going to call this end diastolic volume, right there. Sorry, our y-axis is left ventricle volume. in milliliters. Our x-axis is time. So here's about 120 milliliters. This is called the isovolumetric. It's isovolumic. State. Isovolumic states occur there and there. And that's when relaxation of the heart occurs. Okay, so end systolic volume, though, is right here. S volume. Okay, so end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. This is when the left atrium closes, and there's a lot. It just tops off the left atrium with enough fluid because it's already 80% full, but then it just tops it off. So then it gets about 120 milliliters inside the left ventricle, and then as time goes on, bam, it loses most of its volume. And so this is still an isovolumic state, and that's right here at this point is the end systolic volume, and then it repeats. Blood comes out of the left atrium into the left ventricle, puts back. Okay, so stroke volume, SV, stroke volume, equals EDV minus ESV. That's typically 70 milliliters. And typically our body, say it pumps about 60 beats per minute. So if we're moving 70 milliliters per beat, so 70 times 60, that's like 442. So, or it's like 60 beats is not really common. So more like 70 beats per minute. So 70 times 70 equals 4,900 milliliters. Well, the body normally carries about 5 liters, so our entire blood is being pumped all the way through everywhere in about a minute. So that's pretty neat. Stroke volume is measured like that. Some things that can affect stroke volume, bad valves obviously on our heart, and other things with contractility effects. And there you have it. So this has been a pretty tough go. I need to learn more about end-STEMI and more about STEMI, and actually the physiology behind what we see on the ECG. But that's everything for today. Thanks.